The American Revolution gave way to many iconic generals and politicians, whether it be Washington, Jefferson, or Hamilton. But one American general that doesn't get much publicity today will be General Nathaniel Greene, a man that contributed much to the War for Independence. So, what did he do, and why was he so important? In 1772, Greene would go through an event that would change how we saw the British government. A British official named William Dunnington seized a ship owned by Nathaniel Greene and his brothers. Nathaniel Greene would lead a lawsuit against Dunnington for damages, but whilst the case was happening, the ship will be caught up in the Gaspee Affair. The Gaspee Affair is when a Rhode Island mob torched the ship belonging to the Greene family, the same one that Dunnington seized, on June 9th, 1772, for enforcing the Navigation Acts, a heavily unpopular act. From this point on, Greene would become increasingly alienated from the British and would see it in a negative light from now on. In 1774, after the signing of the Intolerable Acts by the British Parliament, Greene would decide to help form a militia called the Kentish Guards. However, it was because of Greene's limp that he couldn't make the officer rank in the militia. In 1775, the American Revolution began. Following the events of Lexington and Concord, the Rhode Island legislature would form the Rhode Island Army of Observation in May 1775. As for Greene, he would be appointed the new commander of this army. With this army, Greene would march up to Boston and join the many other rebel militias already besieging the city. Greene would become impressed with the rebel militias following the Battle of Bunker Hill. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress would officially create the Continental Army, along with Commander-in-Chief General Washington. Congress would appoint another 16 generals, where Greene would get a commission as a brigadier general. When General Washington took charge of the siege of Boston, he split the army into three divisions. Greene would be given a brigade of 7 regiments to command. The siege of Boston would continue until March 1776. After the events of the siege of Boston, Nathaniel Greene would experience leading troops in the battle for the first time in New York, where General Washington made base in Manhattan because he knew the British would come there next. Before the battle, whilst Washington was fortifying Brooklyn, Greene was promoted to Major General by Congress. Sadly, because of a severe fever, however, he missed out on the Battle of Long Island. This forced General Washington to retreat back to New York City. General Washington wished to fortify the city until convinced by Greene and other officers that this was an impossible task. General Washington instead fortified Harlem Heights just northwest of Manhattan to cover the retreat back across the Hudson River. The British would engage the Continental Army at Harlem Heights. Nathaniel Greene would be commanding the fight at Buckwheat's Field until the British ran out of ammunition and retreated. This battle would serve to be one of the first American victories of the war and an early victory in Greene's military career. In the aftermath of the British seizing New York City, General Washington would appoint Greene to Fort Lee on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River and Fort Washington on the New York side. Despite both forts being on the opposite sides of the Hudson River, Greene made a decision to place troops on the New York side of the river in Fort Washington. He was ultimately able to convince General Washington to let the 3,000-man garrison in Fort Washington to stay put, despite the vulnerability of a British attack. A soon-to-be bad decision. Before the battle, Greene was able to establish supply lines and depots across the line of retreat in New Jersey, a decision that would prove valuable later when Washington's army would be in need of supplies. When the British attack on Fort Washington came on November 16, 1776, a British force led by William Howe was able to capture the fort along with a 3,000-man garrison. A British force under Cornwallis 3 days later captured Fort Lee along with the New Jersey side of the Hudson. General Washington was forced to retreat back across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. These two battles nearly ended Greene's career right then and there had it not been for General Washington's refusal to dismiss him. Greene reproved himself again in the battles of Trenton and Princeton when Greene commanded Washington's army to not only help in taking back the cities, but to capture back parts of New Jersey captured by the British a month earlier. Since the American victory in New Jersey was a success, the British Army would strike back on September 11, 1777, at the Battle of Brandywine Creek, Delaware. The British battled the Americans with the goal of taking Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress resided. Greene commanded the center force of Washington's army. However, the British used the flanking maneuver to envelop the forces. Luckily, Greene's center force prevented a surrounding of the American forces and allowed for an orderly retreat. The British would capture Philadelphia. General Washington would engage in the Battle of Germantown in an attempt to take Philadelphia back, which was another American defeat in retaking the city. Greene would later join Washington in December to set up camp in Valley Forge. Greene would be made quartermaster general, and along with his companions Charles Petit and John Cox, Greene would establish supply depots across vital points all around the colonies. Shortly after the French entry into the war, the British force occupying Philadelphia would retreat back to New York. Nathaniel Greene, Anthony Way, and the Marquis de Lafayette would all recommend an attack on this force since it was going through hostile territory in New Jersey. This resulted in the Battle of Monmouth, although it was indecisive, the Americans did intercept and damage the British forces retreating, so it wasn't a total bummer. Greene would temporarily go back to his home in Rhode Island in August 1778, serving the Battle of Rhode Island. The battle was indecisive. Although the battle was a draw, the British retreated from Newport, but it left the local economy in ruins. Greene returned to his quartermaster position after the battle. After mid 1778, the northern front of the colonies would become a stalemate, the Americans being stationed on the Hudson River and the British staying in New York City would be no exception. As Washington continued to guard the Hudson River with the main army, General Greene will go on to take a contingent of 1,500 men to block the passages into New Jersey, engaging the British in the Battle of Springfield on June 23, 1780. Despite being heavily outnumbered by at least 1 to 3, Nathaniel Greene successfully made the British retreat off the battlefield, thanks to the defiance of American troops preventing both Hessian and British troops from taking two important bridges. After Benedict Arnold's defection to the British Army, Greene would have command of West Point for a time in September 1780. This new position wouldn't last long, however, as the British would break the stalemate not in New York, but down in the southern states. Quartermaster General Nathaniel Greene would eventually have another appointment, the commander of the Southern Department, Nathaniel Greene. Way down south by October 1780, the Americans had lost many battles in the south by defeats under commanders like Horatio Gates at the Battle of Camden, a disastrous defeat for Americans down south. Skilled commanders like Cornwallis were taking control of Georgia, South Carolina, and was moving into North Carolina. General Washington, with the go-ahead from Congress, would appoint Nathaniel Greene as the commander of the Southern Department of the Continental Army. The campaign would begin. Greene would depart for Virginia in October 1780 with 1,600 men to meet the British down south. Whilst on the route to North Carolina, General Greene would learn about an American victory in Kings Mountain, a decisive victory for the American militias, and good news to General Greene as the battle delayed Cornwallis's advance into North Carolina. General Greene would arrive at Charlotte, North Carolina in December 1780. Greene would make a decision to divide his forces, with a small force led by his subordinate Daniel Morgan to go after Tarleton's army in the southwest, while Greene would take the main contingent and go southeast to march against the main detachment against Cornwallis. Morgan would then encounter General Banastre Tarleton at the Battle of Cowpens. The battle was a major victory for the Americans, nearly crushing Banastre Tarleton's force. The two armies would then meet up again and use the maneuver of a strategic retreat to lead Cornwallis's army away from supply lines all the way to the Dam River at the Virginia-North Carolina border. Whilst taking the main contingent north, Greene sent another small force led by Otho Williams to harass the slow-moving British army, so Greene's militia army would match Cornwallis's hungry veteran army. It worked, with Cornwallis having to burn supplies to try and keep up with Greene. Greene received reinforcements from North Carolina and Virginia militias, doubling his force to 4,000 men. General Greene would now engage General Cornwallis at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. General Greene would deploy his army into three lines. The first was the North Carolina militia, supported by backwoods riflemen and artillery guns on each side of the road. The second was the Virginia militia, and the third line was the last line and main force of the Continental Army, supported by more cannons. The battle would begin at 1 p.m. After a brief cannon skirmish. Cornwallis would advance troops on the first American line. The Americans, having the cover of a fence gate, would delay the advance by firing a volley on the whole line. This would be temporary, however, as the British would regroup and engage with bayonets. The North Carolina militia would either retreat from the battlefield or to the second line with the Virginia militia. British would then engage the Virginia militia line, putting up a longer fight but retreating into the woods to scatter the British. The British would later break through the whole American line. Washington's cavalry would move his forces down to the southern portion of the American third line, which in response sent Tarleton's cavalry as a counter. When the British made it to the third line, light infantry Jaegers went in alone, only to be pushed back by cannons, muskets, and bayonets. The same thing would happen again with the 2nd Battalion pushing onto the 2nd Maryland Militia. The inexperienced troops fled as they fired their first shot, but the 2nd Battalion would be counterattacked by Washington's cavalry and the 2nd Maryland Regiment. Cornwallis tried to save the battalion by firing grape shot, killing Americans and British alike, but it worked, and the southern flank was broken. General Greene would order a retreat from the battlefield. Although the battle was a loss for the Americans, the desired results were achieved by inflicting many losses on the British, which actually made the British abandon most of the south for Yorktown. Greene would not participate in the Battle of Yorktown. Instead, he would continue the campaign on the remaining British forces down south, inflicting casualties and whilst losing battles. This wouldn't be needed after the Battle of Yorktown, however, as peace talks would be held and the war would officially end in 1783. As for Greene, he would live on for 2 more years, eventually dying on June 19, 1786, and that is where his story ends. Greene would be remembered after death as a great general, sometimes even said as the second best to Washington himself. He was remembered as being a trustworthy officer to Washington, establishing supply lines, and the genius campaign down south that would help end the war. Some would say he is the most underrated general in American history.